Hello and welcome to the Jewish Heretics podcast. This is the official podcast of the United Jewish People's Order. We are a progressive Canadian Jewish organization that's been around since the 1920s. My name is David Wall. I am the community's cultural director, and I'll be your host today. For this, the 25th episode of our podcast, I had the honor of speaking to celebrated author and academic Jordy Rosenberg. Jordy is the author of the novels Confessions of the Fox, published in 2018, and Night Fawn from 2026, both published by Random House One World. Confessions of the Fox was a New York Times Editor's Choice selection, shortlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize, a Lambda Literary Award, a Publishing Triangle Award, the UK Historical Writers Association Debut Crown Award, and longlisted for the Dublin Literary Award. Confessions of the Fox was recognized by The New Yorker, The Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, Kirkus Reviews, LitHub, Electric Literature, and the Feminist Press, among other places, as one of the best books of 2018. Jordy's work has been supported by fellowships and residencies from MacDowell, the Lannan Foundation, the Banff Center, the Amundsen Getty Foundation, the Society for the Humanities at Cornell University, and the UCLA Center for 17th and 18th century studies. He's a professor in the Department of English and associated MFA faculty in the Program for Poets and Writers at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Jordy and I had a wide-ranging chat touching on topics such as his upbringing, his wild journey as a trans Marxist lover of Jewish humor, and his thoughts on whether the genre of fiction has the power to inspire readers into political action. Here's our conversation. Jordy Rosenberg, thanks so much for taking the time out to be on our podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. Thanks so much for having me.
So we like on Jewish Heretics, which, by the way, is the name of this podcast, we like to get into people's origin stories, as in, where did you get your radical Jewish superpowers?
Mm-hmm.
And more sort of really what that means is, how did you develop your political consciousness? So at the risk of being redundant, because we'll be discussing your latest book, which sort of tells the story of at least your mother, your family a bit. Can you talk about your upbringing with that in mind? What were your parents like? What did they do? Was there any left-wing politics in your home? Was it a Zionist thing? And then how did you come to your politics and your Marxism? How did that develop when you were young?
Okay. Yeah. So I was raised in a very Zionist household, but in a kind of typically a way where the Zionism gets kind of disappeared into its own sort of purported ordinariness. So I don't think I would have thought of it that way or even had the language for it. But my parents, I was raised in New York City, but we lived outside of Tel Aviv for 2 summers or like 4-month stints in 1984 and 1987. My father worked for the Israeli Health Ministry during that time. And then also my mother began working for the American Friends of the Hebrew University in New York, which was the donor machine in New York. And so she was a receptionist, and she was kind of in charge of the logistics of the donors when they would go to do their tours of the Hebrew University every year. So, I mean, they were committed. They also sent myself and my sister to a program called SAR-L, which is actually started by a general who was in the logistics wing of the military, and it translates to service for Israel, service to Israel. It was it still exists. It's a volunteer, quote unquote, volunteer organization that places volunteers on military bases
Wow.
doing, yeah. So, and I actually I did some kind of investigative work around SAR-L, and it's coming out in like a long form podcast episode with the podcast Signal Hill. Got to interview a lot of really interesting people around
Mm-hmm.
it. I can talk about that later if you want to,
Mm-hmm.
but that should be coming out this spring. But yeah, it's one of these tax exempt organizations that is connecting mostly North American and European diaspora Jews with the military, and you're doing military labor and you're embedded on a base. But this is a so-called quote unquote charitable organization. So there's a lot to talk about there. So I spent a fair amount of time there. Um, and I think probably the seed of the radicalization was formed in spending time on the military base, because well, this was during the first Intifada, and I didn't have the language for any of that then. It wasn't given to me, and there was no internet. Um, but I I just had, I think, probably what a lot of people have had and are having en masse, which is just a general feeling that what I was seeing was wrong. And then it took quite a while after that to begin to develop a language and reconstruct a history to understand what was felt wrong to a teenager. I mean, it was a minor. I was sent as a minor, and I really didn't understand what we were doing, but I did know and feel strongly that it wasn't right. And so, you know, you have to do the reconstruction work to come to that understanding.
It's interesting that because sorry to interrupt, not everyone who goes there as a child has a feeling that it's wrong. For example, I went there, my dad took me there a couple times, and I remember just the joy of feeling that I was a member of a club I didn't have to pay any dues to. You know,
Mhm.
back home, I didn't really have friends. I was kind of a geeky little kid, but I went there and it's like, oh, this is my, you know, there was this feeling, instant feeling of belonging and not having to do any work for it. So that that was my reaction. Now, I wasn't on military basis, but I think it points to that you were probably a special kid.
I think there also was something overwhelmingly disturbing when you get up close to it about the culture on the bases, the
Mm,
chauvinism, and the sheer amount of weaponry. Because our jobs on the bases were to wash and clean and prepare and keep weaponry ready to go out. And this is actually a very important part of the way the Israeli military organizes itself, which is it has this mandate about itself that it will only quote fight on outside of its own made up borders. So
hmm
the weapons have to be kept in a state in a storage where they're ready to go out. Um, the SAR-L started after 1982 and the invasion of Lebanon, which really had ensnared Israel in a guerrilla war that it had a really hard time fighting. And I think that after that point, that question of logistics and weapons storage and preparation readiness really became a focus, as well as, by the way, these Hasbara projects, because
hmm
of course that invasion of Lebanon was really was a major public relations fail in 1982 for Israel. Um, in any case, I think seeing that amount of weaponry up close was just I think I don't know how special I was. I think it really has there's a real effect. Um,
And of
you
course,
know,
in your book, there's a sort of tragic comic, almost catch-22 scene with tanks involving tanks and your relative
right.
Abe.
Yeah.
Which is you know, I think tragic comic sort of sums up a lot of your work, but certainly Night Fawn. How
Mhm.
did so how do you go from this kind of developing young person's political consciousness around weaponry to uh, being a Marxist and a much more all-encompassing left perspective? It's
Well,
like the seed, in other words.
yeah, I mean, so that's the seed, right? But then But I mean, I think that, I mean, we're talking about a long time ago in a way, and I don't know that my trajectory is helpful really for anyone these days because mainly because the, I think that because there is a popular international movement for Palestine, solidarity movement, the likes of which we have never seen
Yes.
in our lifetimes. And people know now, and they know because the Palestinians have been documenting their own genocide.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that there's, to a certain extent, an availability of information and a popular consciousness that's very unique to this historical moment. But for me, what I think would take someone a much shorter period of time now took a longer period of time. I Well, let's see. So that's in 1988, and then I went to college in 1989, and I kind of became estranged from my biological family, not around Zionism, but around queerness, which was not really assimilable. And um, I had a real interest in that time in Marx and Marxism and understanding class society and class struggle. And I think for a long time, I kind of compartmentalized what had happened to me in Israel and kind of just kept it in a bubble. It wasn't a bubble I felt good about, but it wasn't really a bubble I realized I had to confront.
Mm.
And I could just go ahead and become a leftist without really thinking through the need to take a position. And this was also because I was learning a kind of academic Marxism that um, wasn't as I wasn't learning a kind of third world Marxism, let's say, at that time. I was learning Marx in the commodity form in a Frankfurt School Marxism in a very particular angle in. So it really took until I began organizing around this, around the Iraq War and the ending of the Iraq War, where it became clear that if you had an anti-war position, you needed to be able to have a position to operate in these spaces around the state of Israel and Zionism, and that it
Interesting.
wasn't enough to just not have a position. And I think it was just the case that at that time, like someone I was organizing with, a comrade, said to me, "You need to take a position," and
Mm.
um, so some conversation, some study. This person had been very persuasive in the way they put it, and it was someone I really respected. Um, so
Interesting.
yeah.
It's interesting that, and obviously this exists, that we can compartmentalize. We can be so left-wing, radical, Marxist, whatever it is, but not be grounded in a position around this incredibly important kind of era-defining conflict or oppression. That is so interesting. And I think like we'll get to this a little later on as well. I want to talk. I want to get into your new book because a lot of these issues are are in there.
Mhm.
Um, so because I'm such a good podcast host, I went back and I'm being facetious. I went back and I did a bunch of research and I looked at some older YouTube videos of you and I read some older articles and of course I read your latest book, which is magnificent. It's right up my alley. I will recommend it to everyone.
Thank you.
Night Fawn. And I found a particular video that I just really loved, and I'm going to reference it because it's a bit of a precursor or preview to your novel. And this is from 2018, I believe.
Mhm.
Um, you're in a bookstore and you give a really charming reading of a work in progress called The Daddy Dialectic.
Mhm.
And this work went on to be expanded and published in the LA Review of Books. And you characterize it at the time in the video humorously as you say a possible sleazy, shticky queer video intro to Marx's Das Kapital.
Hmm.
As opposed to intros to Marxist Capital, Das Kapital, that are boring and soporific. So you're trying to create a more entertaining one. And you say the only shtick capability you have is channeling your late mother. So that's what you do. In order to do an intro to Das Kapital, I know you're being funny, but anyway. And then you tell this tragicomic story about your mom, who you refer repeatedly to as a Yenta, judging you for your sartorial obsessions around what she sees as traditional male clothing. And she seems to think that she'll be able to suppress what she sees as an inevitable lesbianism in her little girl by preventing her from engaging with what she sees things are only for men, which include corduroy coats and tomatoes.
Hmm.
So anyway, it's funny, it's sad, it's all the things, and it's very much a preview of, or very much has a lot of the ingredients of your latest novel. But what I want you to tell me is, can you talk about its Marxist aspect? How is it an intro to Das Kapital? Funny or not? Is it because it's about shopping? I have my theories, but
Hmm.
maybe this will get to the crux of something if you can connect these things.
Okay, yeah. Yes. So the origins of this novel, the novel that you're referencing, Night Fawn, is narrated by the character of Barbara. It's fiction now. She's a transphobe. She is a Zionist, um, and she is writing essentially um, a deathbed apology. She is being cared for by her estranged transgender son, who she believes in her OxyContin haze is actually a large bird, and she believes that the bird is demanding that Barbara, write a Marxist apology for her life. So that apology, which she never really apologizes, is the novel. Originally, though, the piece that you're referring to was nonfiction. It was like an essay from, in my speaking voice, that's kind of about um, how can I explain it? It is on the one hand, it is about some of my reflections about taking care of an estranged parent. And I'm combining that with some Marxist theorizations around the family, both I and some Marxist theorizations around the commodity form. So yes, we're getting, I think, some kind of an introduction into Marx's concept of the fetish, or that is to say, how it is that a commodity comes to take on a kind of meaning and value that is in excess of its actual value.
Right.
Why is it that commodities seem to rule our lives and seem alive while people are deadened? And I won't bore the audience with Marx's arguments around that. But so on the one hand, I'm trying to reckon with this question of the liveliness of commodities in the Marxist sense, and then also some Marxist theorizations around the fetish of the patriarch and racial paternalism. And this was in the kind of first Trump administration, the rise of what's called the psychoanalytic concept of the obscene father figure. So it was Marxism and psychoanalysis. Anyway, so yeah, that piece is written as an essay in my voice, but there are a couple moments in it when I do ventriloquize my mother's voice. And when I was reading that piece out loud in the video that you're talking about, when I read this one line that my mother actually in reality had said to me, there was an outburst of incredible laughter. And that kind of stuck with me as I was thinking about.
Is it who nobody likes having sex with men? Was that the line?
Yeah, I had in reality and in life, I tried to argue with her around sexuality, and I think I'd said I don't like having sex with men, and she said no one likes having sex with men, which was like quite a zinger. Um,
Great.
and I just thought a lot about that moment of laughter afterwards, and the kind of melancholic knot of like KNOT of the way in which these figures, maybe in our family, whose politics we reject, are lodged inside us, and how can we speak in those voices? Like, what's that voice still doing there inside you? What was it doing for the audience to hear it? I started to think about maybe some of the political potentialities of humor and satire specifically, in terms of send-ups of Zionism and in terms of channeling anger, which satire does very well, around Zionism. So I mean, believe it or not, that's a short version of explaining how it went from being an essay to a novel. But I hope I've done an okay
No,
job.
that's great. I do want to talk more about Night Fawn, obviously. It's an incredible work. It's very Jewish and New York-y. It's got elements of magic realism and kind of surrealist psychedelia, Borscht Belt hilarity, lesbian trans fiction, Marxism. It's a real cornucopia. I had an absolute blast reading it, and it was very, very moving.
Mm.
I read another book recently, and you just sort of answered this, but I do want to get more into it because I think it's really important. I read another book recently called Mother Mary Comes to Be by
Yeah.
Arundhati Roy.
Yeah.
And there's some similarities. I mean, obviously, on the surface, not. But it's another kind of pseudo, like autofiction, autobiographical novel centered around a mother. And the
Mhm.
mother's a very ambivalent figure. In fact, Arundhati's mother is seen as almost monstrous, emotionally tortures her kids, but ultimately becomes almost sympathetic as a woman exerting her identity and power in a patriarchal world, racist patriarchal world. You take this, and you just mentioned it, you take this a major step further and actually center the subjectivity of your mother. And I'm saying your mother because you said it's fiction, but you know, this is one of these things where it's obviously engaging. Well, not obviously. It seems to be engaging with a real story, your story. So it's about it's seeming to tell your own story through a kind of narrative filter. And for most of the book, we're in your mother's head, but your mother is dying of cancer and is under the influence of heavy drugs, which leads to wild hallucinations and it's sometimes really weird, bizarre narrative voice. Can you talk about the decision to use this device a little bit more? Why did you
Yeah.
choose to create autofiction, but through the lens of really the most unreliable narrator ever? I mean,
Yeah.
she's on drugs. You know,
There's
it's an amazing thing. It's just amazing.
there's a couple ways to answer that. Um, the first thing I think you'll be familiar with, I think, as a rationale. Um,
Mhm.
I think, and of course, a novel takes a very long time to write. It took at least, I don't know, 7 or 8 years, and the political landscape changes, and we can talk about that as well. But at the time that I kind of made a commitment to tell this from her perspective, I think I had come to believe that one thing you could do, um, by narrating from within her own perspective was kind of, one, lean into the kind of aggression, paranoia, and obsessiveness of the transphobe. I mean, I'm also really thinking a lot about transphobia here, and give it fictional life. It's from her perspective, so you get inside the absolutely unraveling paranoid thoughts about trans people, for
Hmm.
example,
Hmm.
that she has. Um, One of the things I realized that you could also do is that, um, telling it from within her perspective is a way of portraying what I was getting at earlier, which is that ubiquity and ordinariness with which colonial ideology has been normalized within diaspora households. So I wanted to be very honest about what has gone on here. And part of that was depicting a character who enjoys certain forms of power, who identifies in an unconcealed way with colonial projects, who is kind of, um, embodying someone who's not going to conceal or hedge over the libidinal aspects and appeal of cruelty to her, because those libidinal aspects are part of how those ideologies perpetuate. But I want to say something about the question of memoir versus fiction. Arundhati Roy's book, which I enjoyed a great deal, is a memoir. Um, And another reason why I didn't write this as memoir is that in reality, uh, around in reality, I had a somewhat different relationship to the actual person, Barbara, than I do to the character.
Mm-hmm.
One thing, we actually didn't get into it much about Zionism. Part of that is because the way I entered anti-Zionism was very strictly, maybe, extremely strictly as an anti-colonial movement. I didn't really think about um, myself. I didn't really think of myself as a Jew doing anti-Zionist work. I really just thought of myself as an someone with anti-colonial commitments. And I, first of all, I didn't have a very close relationship with my parents anyway, but I think I thought I did not see it as a good use of my political time to debate with them about it. So I really didn't get into it about Zionism with my parents. Around her homophobia and transphobia, the actual Barbara and I did reconcile. She apologized, which was incredible to me, and that was meaningful to me. But what I want to say about that, I really think it's important, or it's important to me at least. If I was going to write a memoir about someone who was a Zionist and a transphobe, and it ends with our reconciliation, to me, that's departing from a political message that is important to me in writing in general.
Right.
Um, the political message, I think, of the book that I wrote, I hope, or at least to me, is about confronting Zionism, that we don't have to reconcile with Zionists. There's no reconciliation between these two characters. Uh, because I don't think those scenes of individual reconciliation, and lots of people feel differently than I do. Lots of anti-Zionist Jewish activists feel differently. This is just me. But I don't personally feel that those scenes of individual reconciliation are particularly politically salient. So that actually wasn't a story that I wanted to put forward. And
Interesting.
yeah,
Yes, yes,
if you
yes.
think about reconciliation as well, it's not good narratively. I don't know if you saw the Frankenstein remake.
I didn't see it yet.
Oh,
Should I?
well, it's beautiful, but I don't know. Can I give a spoiler?
Go ahead.
It ends in an absolutely crazy way. Like my jaw was on the floor. It ends with Frankenstein's monster saying to Victor Frankenstein, "I forgive you, Dad." It's
Oh my goodness.
it's ridiculous. But so it's narratively, I think ending on a reconciliation is absurd. It doesn't work. Now it's not really great narratively. So that's another thing to say. But really politically, it just wasn't something I was interested in putting into the world. Um, so yeah, fiction for me allowed it to be me to kind of um, um, I, extrapolate a fictional scenario that is about confrontation, not reconciliation.
And to avoid the redemptive sentimentality of a which
Yeah,
deadens
exactly.
the politics. Yeah, I get it.
But exactly.
That's very interesting. Very
Yeah.
interesting. Um, like all great books, your novel has plenty of sex and death.
Uh-huh.
Maybe more death. I don't know. Maybe I'll total it up. But anyway, I'd like to read a quote to you from the book, and it's actually said to the reader by the unreliable narrator, the mother character. But in many ways, it feels like it could be your own voice, maybe, and it's like a nugget of wisdom. It
Mhm.
appears relatively early in the book in the context of the death of a female family member. And here's the quote: "This is a man." Or sorry, what is a man? The truth is, it doesn't have to do with corduroy jackets, and in fact, it doesn't have a thing to do with genitalia either. Neither clothes nor sex makes you a man. What makes you a man is how you die. Which I just think is this really incredible line that leapt out of the page at me. Can you elaborate on this? What does your mother or the mother mean by this really stunning last line?
I mean, that isn't something my mother said. There was just chat. That was, one of the first, that scene was one of the first scenes of this book that I really wrote. And I was just kind of channeling, figuring out who this character was and what she thought. Um,
Sorry, you mean that your actual mother never said that, but
she never said that. My
yeah, yeah.
mother had never said that line. Yeah. Um, I think this is just, I'm not sure I'm going to have I'll probably think of something later because it's not something I thought about much. There's just some way in which I was trying to get at the absolutely like ontological nature of how this character thinks about gender, that she thinks about it as an absolute, like it codes even your death.
Hmm.
And that she's very, very, very invested in the gender binary. And she's kind of in that scene, she's reflecting with horror and on what she sees as the absurdity of her daughter trying to tunnel her way out of the kind of um, what she sees as the kind of like degradation of being female that she feels her daughter needs to accept.
I see.
So um,
And
that's
yet,
how
so
I thought.
maybe I'm
Yeah.
misinterpreting though. Up until
Okay.
that last line, what makes you mad is how you die. It
Mhm.
sounds the opposite of transphobic. The truth is,
Oh,
it doesn't have to do with corduroy jackets.
yeah.
Doesn't have to do with genitalia.
Hmm.
It's almost like she's being herself. Maybe I'm misinterpreting. So I found the line stunning. But
No, I think, well, you know what? Of course, I feel that books really take on their meaning when they're interpreted because
mm,
what we write is like an unconscious. So I accept it however you interpret it. It doesn't matter that much to me, my own interpretation.
you're just the writer. I'm the
Yeah,
podcaster.
right. That's the podcast. It's all up to the podcasters now.
Um, can we go back? I was just so taken with the daddy dialectic, and I like going back and forth between these two texts.
Okay.
Is it okay if I go and ask another question about the daddy dialectic?
Sure.
Um, uh, it's interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, you published that essay in the LA Review of Books around the same time your first novel came out, Confessions of the Fox. So it's a sign of a writer's life that you were already kind of planting the seeds for your next novel at that moment.
Mhm.
Um, but I want to ask about it because it's like a sketch for your latest novel, but I also see it as a bit of a skeleton key for unlocking a lot of your concerns, the Jordy Rosenberg concerns of you as a writer and thinker. So I want to read you a quote and get your reaction. So you say the resistance to fascism goes nowhere, has never gone anywhere, will never go anywhere when it hews to so-called enlightenment, that is colonialist principles and quote virtues unquote. And it definitely does not go anywhere when sotto voce from the ass end of a Prius. I'm almost done.
Yeah.
No one ever coffee talked a fascist out of his fascism. So what kind of resistance to fascism hews to colonialist principles? What do you mean by that? And how can we avoid them? What's an alternative method?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, I mean, well, the alternative method is just organizing and probably at this point, like, an anti-imperial class struggle, but and a general strike, and everybody knows that. But um, I think in that piece, and you went exactly to the place that I would have gone to myself to explain both one of the hearts of that piece and then what it had to do with turning that piece into a novel, which is that, yeah, it was the first Trump administration, and there was a kind of like liberal shudder that we're all familiar with that was completely unhelpful, and did nothing. And I guess the piece was articulating a kind of frustration with liberal articulations of, let's say, d- d- um, they've got a bad taste in their mouth about Trumpian fascism and these liberal calls for like civility and reasonableness,
Mm,
which were just kinds of like Enlightenment style useless bemoaning that wasn't backed up by organizing. So I was trying to work something out about the place of unreason, maybe, you know, this become has for me become a more refined question around cultural production, but at the time something about the place of unreason in relation to militancy. And
hmm
in that piece I was drawing on Suzanne Sethaire's call for transformation of sensibility as like an important part of revolutionary movements. And she says something like there's a needs to be a combination of readiness for the marvelous with an army of negation. And I think
mm,
when I was thinking about turning that memoir piece into a nonfiction book, which was what I had thought I was doing originally, I I I came to feel that there really was no way to let go of the kind of reasonableness that I was arguing against in an essay form. But I wanted to more so, and this is just the kind of thinker I am. I mean, there's plenty of amazing essays out there, but what I was more interested in was embodying the argument of the essay around fighting fire with fire, or devilishness with devilishness, or really, especially you can see in the ways that the right has seized on humor and meme culture, fighting satire against, I don't know, a cruel fascist, quote unquote, humor. The form that was appropriate to doing that for me was the novel, because novels are not reasonable documents. They are fueled by emotion and by that like incalculable encounter between the reader and the book.
Mm.
So I think that, I hope that's addressed what you're
No, that's
asking.
great. Oh, one thing that you talk about in this essay, and you also mentioned earlier in another answer you gave, you talked about the sort of eroticism of cruelty, or you and you talk about desire itself, and maybe queer desire as being connected to uh, uh, I guess a prescriptive or a reparative, maybe anti-fascist type of program as well. Can you talk a little bit of that? Because you do talk about desire in the essay,
Well,
and I'd like to understand that
I
more.
I don't think that's very worked out on my part. Um, because of course there's nothing that has ever stopped queer people from being on the side of the fascists. And you could see that certainly when you've got queer Israeli soldiers holding up, you know what I mean, flags that say "in the name of love" as they're
Mm,
bombing Gaza, which that was that famous photograph that went around at the beginning of the genocide. Um, but I think other people have written about this kind of thing much better than I do. In particular, I think about there's a poet named Kay Gabriel who's written quite a bit about transness and desire, and um, also Kay Gabriel and Andrea Abbey Karam together edited a collection of trans poetry called "We Want It All," and in the introduction there, they I think they are in some way talking about. Um, they say something like that there is a place. Poetry doesn't replace political action, but it does. They say provide a way to inhabit revolutionary
yeah, yeah,
practice.
yeah.
Um, And what they say there is, we think that poetry conjoins and extends the interventions that trans people make into our lives and bodily presence in the world, which always have an aesthetic dimension. I think for them, it may be that there are certain, um, let's say, um, particularities about queer and trans, maybe cultural production, that is a specification of something that can be attached to more universal um, questions, like um, just a general way to think about the aesthetic dimensions of inhabiting revolutionary practice. Just
Right.
say that, um, yeah, that there. I think they are sort of arguing that there is a specific engagement with the question of bodily presence that trans people make, that is one facet, let's say, of a larger question around the issue of mediation, the mediation of our struggle, the mediation of material conditions through um, forms of aesthetic forms. Now, I don't
Mm,
know, that all probably sounded very abstract, but I mean, I guess ultimately we can't, there's no way to make an instrumental argument about the place of desire in a movement. But it certainly is the case, I mean, the easiest answer to say is the thing that we see every day, which is that the way in which, for example, fascist movements play on people's desire and try to substitute the sort of pleasures of cruelty for actual material, um, addressing people's lives materially,
yeah.
right? Like, and so. I think it's clear that on a certain level, like the left, a culture that makes the left desirable is part of building a culture of the left. But obviously, you can't. It doesn't really mean anything if unless you're like able to change people's lives materially or struggle for that. So, uh,
I wonder if it relates to, in a very simplistic way, to the sort of Emma Goldman concept of, not wanting to be a part of a relationship that doesn't have dancing. In other words,
mhm,
accessing pleasure. Um,
yeah, mhm. Yeah, no, yes, I see that
um,
connection. Yeah.
this relates to. I'm sorry, I'm being so tangential, and I'm not talking about your book enough. But I do want to. We'll talk more about that. But I saw there's a wonderful conversation you have with China Melville online, the
Uh-huh.
great China Melville, who's speculative fiction, science fiction, nonfiction, children's books, and just this incredibly compassionate man. And in the discussion you have with him, he expresses almost momentarily, at least, a kind of guilt he has around being a fiction writer.
Mm,
Like the sort of cliche, it's not important or serious enough during a dark time, historical, all this cruelty, et cetera, et cetera. And he says that he's come to realize that he doesn't need to feel guilty, that fiction has the potential to aid in moving through trauma in specific ways, to be reparative.
mhm, mhm.
How do you deal with this challenge as a socially and politically engaged activist and thinker? What can fiction do for us in a world of cruelty? And you kind of already uh, kind of talked about this, but fiction per se, and I think it does relate to Night Fawn as well, because you chose fiction as opposed to memoir. What is it
Right.
about fiction that can engage and be reparative?
Oh, gee. I mean, well, I can't really speak to, I mean, China's formulations are sui generis, and I can't speak to that, although I love his work and speaking with him. I think that there are, um,
Okay, let me rephrase. Sorry, let me rephrase because
oh, no, no,
or
I
you
wasn't,
have an answer. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
well, I wasn't refusing your question. I was just
Mm,
acknowledging like he may have his own
yeah.
perspective. I think my current feeling is, I've been pretty um, fortified lately by a recent return and reread um, of Trotsky's Literature and Revolution. I've been really, it's kind of a wild reread, and um, he, he says,
Sorry, can I just interrupt?
yeah,
There's a hilarious part in your book in Night Fawn in which Trotsky comes up.
oh yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
the part that
Trotsky,
you actually, or whoever
yeah,
the character representing you narrates, that's
there's no
just really
kidding.
funny. Yeah. Anyway, sorry. Go on.
Um, no, I mean well, the first thing is, one of the things that I think is great is he's like inveighing against these authors who, like just about around 1917, or these bourgeois authors who are kind of like, um, try to claim that literature isn't political.
Hmm.
And I mean, we actually see a version of that these days. There's like been some attempts to like argue for like, like zealously argue for the mildness of literature. And Trotsky says that the kind of whipsawing motion between sort of revolutionary and counter-revolutionary movements just before 1917, he says, struck the intelligentsia heavily and continuously as with a battering ram, and in the face of this political intensity, bourgeois art insisted on its own, quote, terrifying helplessness. So there's a lot of that going on. But what he's basically arguing is that like all literature is political. It's just that some is non-revolutionary and some is revolutionary. Now, but the question is, and then what does that revolutionary literature kind of do for us? I like, I love what China says, and I think it's true. I think recently, um, there, I don't know if you read Wissam Rafidi's novel Trinity of Fundamentals, which is about, it's just recently translated into English. It's about a PFLP member who's running a printing press during the first Intifada, kind of underground.
Hmm.
And then the writer Kaleem Hawat did a great review of it, and he is just basically draws out that novels can ask certain questions of us that, again, these like zealously mild authors would claim that they can't. Questions like, what is political commitment? What is the role of culture in national liberation? These are more specific questions than China is referring to, but it was a different political moment. I mean, I really think we're in a moment where people are really trying to think about cultural production as part of a political movement. I'm not saying in an instrumental way, and neither was Trotsky, but I mean, really having to think about this question. And um, Fargo Tabaki, in a piece that I think a lot of people read recently, it was called The Craft Notes in an Hour of Genocide, I
Oh, right.
think,
Yeah, yeah.
says creative work readies us for material work by offering a space to try out strategies, think through contradictions, remind us of our own agency. I do think that question of reminding the reader of their agency, that the reader is necessary to give a novel meaning. It only takes on meaning, and that is different from, say, an essay in a way, I think.
Yes.
The novel really only takes on its significance in the relationship with the reader, and that is a relationship of a certain kind of agency. So I think they're arguing, about the ways in which cultural production is inextricable from a political, scene of struggle. But finally, I guess, and needless to say, I think we're in a moment where it's also important to say, like, it's always more valuable, I think, to take a collective stand of refusal of writing and refusal of participation and withdrawal of labor. I'm talking about specifically around BDS. That, to me, those collective actions are more important than any one person, or certainly than anything I could say individually. So at the end of the day, I think the question of writing about politics is superseded by the political act,
Yes.
which is a collective act. Um, but of course, um, writing and that political act are not dissolvable one into the other in a one-to-one way. It's always this question of trying to figure out, what is the relationship of the two? Is it nourishing a political movement? Is it accompanying it? Is it giving it moral strength in a moment? Is it addressing trauma? I guess as I don't remember exactly the words that China had, but so yeah, I guess that's where I'm at on that.
No, it's fascinating. And you've segued nicely by mentioning BDS.
Hmm.
So I want to talk about Jewish stuff a bit.
Okay.
Um, the organization I work for is proudly Jewish. We've been around for 100 years. We
Mhm.
started in 1926. And Jewishness is obviously all over your work, both in many of the literary and philosophical figures that you engage with, Marx and Benjamin, for example, but also, of course, in your language and subject matter. Can you describe your Jewish identity now?
Gosh.
Um, are you a secularist? Do you engage in Jewish practice of any kind? Do you wish you could do more? Does it matter?
I don't know if this is going to be the answer that you want, but I really, yeah, I'm very secular, and I don't engage in Jewish practice. I think my relationship to my Jewishness has been largely defined by what I described earlier, which is that I have not seen my Jewishness as particularly urgent matter in relation to my political organizing.
Mm,
Once again, I respect people for whom that's the case, and I think people have been doing really, really important work in these areas. I'm just not that person, and I'm also not a good person to recruit Jews on the fence. I don't have the patience for it. Um, I so
do you mean in relation to Palestine politics when you say on the
Yeah,
fence? Yeah,
like
yeah.
don't anyone send me in with them because I just think, oh, these people are plants. We got to get them out of here.
Yeah,
I'm not good with it at all.
yeah.
But I mean, but I am very, I mean, everyone will, it's frequently people will say I'm very culturally Jewish. I mean, I have a lot of, this is how I was formed as a subject is in relation to certain um, I don't know, a lot of the humorous tradition, I guess I would say more than anything. I'm not really interested either in the Jewish ethical tradition. So I don't know if I'm a good candidate for your podcast, but at
No,
least I provide a counterpoint.
you don't
Um,
know our organization because we are staunchly secularists.
okay,
So
okay.
we are left social justice. In fact, we were so secular that it was anti-theist for many decades.
Oh
So
yeah.
it's perfect. It's a
Um,
perfect
but
marriage.
I mean, I think I'm very a really good book and a really good history can get me re-interested in some of these questions. Like I think I'm sure I assume you may have read already like a galley of Molly Crabapple's History of the Bund.
Yes, of course. And I interviewed her about that. Yeah.
Yes, I saw that, and it's incredible. It's an incredible book, and I mean it's very hard to read that and not feel, in a very pointed way, the extent to which, these radical histories have been suppressed, like really, really strenuously suppressed and erased
Mm.
for us. But those are class histories as much as they are Jewish histories. And she makes this point as well. Um, uh, maybe not in those words exactly, but maybe in some pretty close words. So, so much of it has to do with McCarthyism, right? And
Mm.
ways in which histories were just, um, uh, like abolished by the McCarthyist project. So reading something like that will get me re-interested in some of these questions, but it doesn't really not really in like in a way
So
that it
do,
and that.
are you resisting? And I've always been this way as well. You're resisting a kind of tribalism. It sounds like as well. You don't necessarily want
Oh my
to
God, I
couch
no,
everything into Jewishness and Jewish that and what's good for the Jews and et cetera, et cetera.
no,
Yeah.
no. But I
Yeah.
mean, I have a pretty strong political feeling about this, which is, I mean, this is really a reduction, but I've never really, I, to me, it doesn't feel like it's, oh, gee. I mean, it's a very important part of coalitional politics, but it doesn't feel like something I can really. I'm not strategic enough to be able to devote myself to it. I
Hmm.
don't feel like it doesn't lend itself to rallying cries that really resonate with me. I have to be honest. Um, but I certainly have seen the necessity of it and for it and the usefulness of that kind of work and people's tireless organizing in those areas, certainly recently, at least.
It's interesting. As a sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
As a secular organization, we started to face this new reality. There among the young and among the Jewish young and the radical left anti-Zionist or Zionist critical Jewish young, there is more and more of a pull towards this sort of what they call spirituality, or I just call religion.
Yes, there is.
And this is part and parcel of that is that if you look at Jewish Currents magazine, which was it would have
Yeah.
been unthinkable 20 years ago, say that they would have weekly parsha portions where they're talking about the this week's Torah portion. I mean, now they're doing it through a political lens, and they're doing it as a kind of an excuse to engage politically. But still, it's an amazing moment. And we are facing this, and I have this feeling, this sinking feeling that a sort of reimagining of Jewish religious impulse is the future. Maybe I'm just having these sort of paranoid moments, but um, I just see it more and more that people want that, and I don't, but it is an interesting moment. I don't.
Um, yeah, I really didn't think that you were going to want to talk about this. And I
We
think,
don't
I
have
mean,
to. We don't have
no,
to.
it's just interesting because a lot of it feels like I'm very, very comfortable having this as internal debate. And I do have it as an internal debate with a lot of comrades who do this kind of organizing, and often I lose in those debates because I have very vulgar positions on it.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
but I think me personally, I kind of fall more on the like. Karl Marx and the Jewish question side of things,
Yeah.
which has to, yeah. I Oof. But I mean, but on the, here's the thing. On the other hand, for a long time, well, I recently feel like I've had to reckon with this issue, which is just because one feels they wish the political situation were different doesn't mean that you can organize as if it is. It is what it is. And if this is where people are, I mean, this is part of what we mean by meeting people where they're at. But we also have to ask, well, who are the people we're trying to meet where they're at and where is it most efficacious?
Hmm. Hmm.
Me personally am not really invested in restoring some kind of like sense of goodness to diasporic Jewishness, which is part of why probably that authorized me to write like a biting satire of, exposing certain, like I said, libidinal attachments to cruelty. I mean, I don't think it's a strategic decision other people might have made. So it gives you a sense of where I'm at on that. Um,
Here's a
and
question for you.
open
Oh,
to
sorry.
being,
Finish. Go ahead. Sorry.
just open to being debated, and I often lose.
It's funny. Um, I asked Naomi Klein, Naomi Klein was on this podcast, and I asked,
Right.
she said that, so I asked her, is there something, because there's this sort of Americanism that we in Canada often find exotic and weird,
Yeah.
which is this belief in this kind of almost platonic form of America, or like I don't know, even lefties often have an allegiance to an idealized America. I'm thinking of I remember seeing an interview with Ken Kesey, the ultimate rebel, iconoclast, saying that he believed in America. There's a love of
Mhm.
the Constitution, a Bill of Rights, so the sort of faith in this thing. Do you think there's something basic, special, and salvageable about America?
Oh my
Is this
God. I think that I'm not, maybe this will seem like a dodge. I'm going to fall back on something also that Kay Gabriel and Andrea Abbey Karam said about this. They were talking about literature, but they were talking about the way in which literature can function politically to, their quote was, force an encounter between the ideal and the actual. I
Mm,
think sometimes politically, strategically, forcing an encounter between the ideal of a democratic America and the actual can be useful. Um, and sometimes no. So I don't think I have feelings about it beyond the question of like when and where is it strategically useful.
So, and then maybe, so that was part one of the question. And we're getting to the end now. It's quarter
Sure.
after. But so is there something salvageable about America? And what I asked Naomi was, is there something salvageable after October 7th about Jewishness? Is there
Mm.
something about Jewish identity that is worth investing in? Is there something special about Jewishness that is that we can take either comfort from or inspiration from, or does Jody Rosenberg just say, "I don't care"?
Oof. I mean, I I well,
Yeah,
I
because
mean,
Naomi would say
it,
Spinoza, or whatever. I don't know what she'd say,
I
but
mean,
but
yeah, I'm sure she would answer it. And I know Naomi and respect her.
Mhm.
Presumably she answered it differently than how I'm going to answer it.
Mhm.
And she's, been made much more a political dent in the world than I have. But
Mhm.
um, it's hard for me to imagine a rallying cry that we could get around for that one. Like, make us good again. Who is our constituency? Who are we in community with? If that's our goal, what's the horizon of that political demand or hope? I Again, I might be being kind of ultra left on that. I think something like Molly's book is a really much more sober a, and much more strategic approach to that question, which is to fill the answer to your question with history, with a very, not just the facts of history, but a compelling history that we can attach to. But again, it's a history that is a history of working class organizing, as well as Jewish organizing. And she's so careful to go into the debates between the Bolsheviks, for example, and the Bund. And I mean, I think understanding the extremely textured and complicated historical landscape is much more important than answering this question of the salvageability of Jewishness. But, and finally, I'll say, I think some people enter into anti-Zionism through that question. And in
Yes.
fact, there
Yes.
was a brief moment where even I entered into that moment, entered into anti-Zionism. In part, did have a feeling, I would say it lasted for about 6 months, of Jewishness has been betrayed by this. And actually, the person who disabused me of this,
yeah, that's what I'm getting at. That thing.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
But the person who disabused me of this, and I'm very grateful to her, was an Israeli anti-Zionist, because they don't grow up with that diaspora myth. And she said to me, I mean, this was decades ago, but something like, well, you're just reiterating that Jewish exceptionalism that's the problem to begin with. What are you talking about? So,
Mm-hmm.
but I bring this up to say I do think that some people enter into politics, they have that feeling in the beginning, and that's a thing about, thank God people were willing to meet me where I was at, but I'm not a good person to meet other people who are there. So we can send someone else or give them Molly's book, because I think that people need to be moved past that emotion and that political affect to something else that they can be more coalitional with, and more broad-based, that opens into a broader political movement.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Jordy, we're going to have to leave it there because we've reached our limit.
Great.
And I'm sorry we didn't end talking about your amazing novel. I really want people to go out and get it and read it. It's phenomenal.
Thank you, David. It's a good timing to end it because my dogs have started to circle me like sharks. So, but thanks for talking, and I don't mind talking. I'm glad that we talked about what we talked about. So,
oh, good. I'm glad. Okay, good. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too. Thanks so much.
Well, we've come to the end of our show. We'd like to thank you for listening. We'd like to thank everyone who made our podcast possible, including United Jewish People's Order Executive Director Serena Sarin, and of course our guest, Jordy Rosenberg. This podcast was recorded at Walt Whitman Studios in Toronto. The theme music was composed by Serena Sarin with help from me. My name's David Wall. Until next time, seid gesund.